The morning disruption. The mail that Tuesday morning had ideas above its station. Usually it arrives like most of us do, willing, unremarkable, and about to be sorted into piles that add up to nothing. That morning it walked in, sat down, and told me where to stand. I don't mean literally. Fritz slid the breakfast tray through the door of the office at 9:30 with his usual tact. Coffee, a roll with some spread that could make a bishop forget his vows, and a silver plate that had no business holding anything but sugar. Instead of sugar, there was a postcard, picture side up, showing a lighthouse that had been kissed by too many winds and not enough paint. The caption said, "Beckett's Light, Long Island." The card didn't belong there. Fritz doesn't garnish the tray with visual culture. He said, "It came with the rest. The postman's bag, it was wet." I was displeased, and then left me with it, which is Fritz's way of saying, "Don't get crumbs on the postcard, or you'll be displeased." On the message side, someone had done their best to conserve ink. No greeting, no signature. Just 6 words, clean block letters. "At 3 on Thursday, a man will die because you will not stand." The postmark said Midtown, the stamp was current, and the handwriting was the kind that doesn't give you its left or right without a fight. Straight up and down, printed like a schoolroom poster. Whoever wrote it was old-fashioned enough to choose a lighthouse and modern enough to keep their fingerprints out of the flour. 9:30 is an awkward hour at the brownstone. Wolfe, having eaten, is with the orchids and strictly on loan to no one. From 9 to 11, he's an altar boy, and the orchids are the god. Interrupting that is a practice I leave to visitors willing to test their luck with lightning. I've seen him interrupted twice in 10 years. Once was blood, once was Inspector Kramer. Both times were memorable, and neither improved relations. I tucked the card onto the corner of my desk, poured coffee, and considered inventing a third emergency. You probably think the line about "you will not stand" lured me up there like a trout to a fly. That line did a lot of things in a short time. It was rude. It was accurate. Wolfe stands when he must, and only when he must. Nobody who knows him would confuse him with a man who pops up to greet strangers. It also had the gall to make cause and effect out of his weight, his habits, and someone else's mortality. You can insult me, insult my tie, insult the carpet. A postcard suggesting Wolfe's preferences have a body count is another tier. I did not climb the stairs. I'm not as reckless as I sometimes sound. Instead, I called Lon Cohen at the Gazette and asked him, purely hypothetically, if anyone had been sending anonymous predictions by mail lately. Lon said no, and what hypothetical was I drinking with breakfast? I told him nothing for print, and he swore he'd keep the ink in his well. At 11 to the minute, the office door opened. That is not a normal door. The hinges are in good shape and the knob doesn't squeak, but you know when it's Wolfe. The air changes. He entered and did the usual, looked at the chair he's been looking at for years, lowered himself into it like you lower a piano, and found the right angle for his bulk and the light. He takes longer to sit than some men take to die. Then he noticed me noticing him and permitted me to live. I slid the postcard across the desk blotter. He took it with 2 fingers like a used handkerchief would bite. He read it twice, which means once for the words and once for what was between them, and put it flat in the center of the blotter. He said, which, from Wolfe, covers a range that for the rest of us would take a paragraph. On the back, I said, we have Beckett's Light on Long Island, as scenic as a tooth. He shook his head without moving it. Emotional embroidery does not improve a fact. Then let's make a quilt later. The postmark is Station S, yesterday noon. Print letters, clean. No return address, and I can testify Fritz did not put it there as a garnish. I inferred, Wolfe said. He tapped the card once with a finger. And you resisted the urge to interrupt me at the orchids. Commendable. Please ring for beer. I rang. Fritz appeared with a tray because Fritz and beer and Wolfe are a triangle you can't mistake from any angle. Wolfe took his glass, the first of the day, and considered it as if the foam had sent him a letter too. "It is," he said, "a stupid provocation." "Which is the best kind?" I said, "since the smart kind can't be traced." "Do you take it seriously?" "I take all impositions seriously," he sipped. "A man who writes such a thing hopes to move me. His choice of verb is deliberate." "Stand," I said. "Yes, and that presumes he knows that I—" His mouth tightened. "Pa, put it in a folder. We will not dignify it by setting it on the mantel." That was a dismissal if I wanted it, and sometimes I plot the line I'll exit on that leaves me looking competent. This was not the day. "The time," I said. 3 on Thursday. That's specific." "It is ostentatiously specific. It is also absurd. If a man will die on Thursday because of my posture, we may be assured the man has already been selected for death, and the posture is adornment." He breathed. "You spoke to Mr. Cohen." I asked him if the city had acquired a postcard profit. "It hasn't. I didn't mention names or addresses." "Good." He tilted his head in a way that told me he didn't like admitting the next thing. "We shall humor him?" "We will. I didn't bring you a clown. Don't be fatuous. We will accept the premise." He set the glass down as if that concluded negotiations with the beer. "At 3 on Thursday I will be in this chair." "You always are," I said. "Between 2 and 4 at least." "I will be in this chair," he repeated, "and you will be in that one. Fritz will be instructed not to admit callers. Theodore will be told not to pass messages. There will be no interruptions. We will observe whether our visitor elects to supply proof of his allegation." Before I could ask what kind of proof he expected, the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the office like a knife through butter, and I saw Wolfe's eyes narrow slightly. 2 visitors in one morning was unusual. 2 visitors on the morning we received an anonymous threat was suspicious. I went to the front door and peered through the one-way glass. A woman stood on the stoop, maybe 40, with dark hair and the kind of careful composure that suggested she'd been practicing it. Her coat was expensive but not showy, and she held a manila envelope in one gloved hand. I opened the door. "Good morning. Are you Archie Goodwin?" Her voice had sand in it, like she'd been up most of the night. "I need to see Mr. Wolfe. It's about postcards. Plural." That got my attention. I stepped back and let her in, taking her coat and leading her to the office. Wolfe didn't rise. He never does for anyone short of the president, and even then he'd think about it. But he inclined his head, which passes for courtesy in his world. "Miss," I said. "Later, Ainsley," she said, settling into the red leather chair. She opened the envelope and withdrew 3 postcards, laying them side by side on the desk. "Whoever sent these told me things before they happened. And unless you people live on clocks for fun, the next one is a murder, and the reason for it, apparently, is you." She swallowed. "Because you will not stand." I didn't look at Wolfe, but I could feel his interest increase by a measurable amount. With Wolfe, that's the same as a gasp and a half in anybody else. "Sit, Miss Ainsley," he said, and the timbre dropped a shade. "You have our attention." She pushed the 3 cards closer. They were like ours, only not. One showed a bridge, another a pier, the third our friend with the lighthouse. The printing was the same, tidy block letters, careful and controlled. "Miss Ainsley," Wolfe murmured, "we will not be precipitate. You will tell us, in order, what each card foretold and how it occurred." And so she began, with a voice that steadied as she spoke, describing predictions that had come true with uncomfortable precision. By the time she finished, it was clear we weren't dealing with a simple crank or a lucky guesser. Someone was orchestrating events with the kind of careful planning that made my spine itch. Wolfe hadn't moved his hands, and his beer had gone warm, untouched. That told me everything I needed to know about how seriously he was taking this. "Miss Ainsley," he said finally, "you will leave the cards here. You will return at 7:30 this evening alone. We will have either relief or further questions for you." After she left, I looked at Wolfe. Well? He finally allowed himself to look at the postcards the way a chess player looks at a middle game he didn't arrange. "Well," he said, "we are insulted." "That's not new. Not universally," he said. "This, however, is particular, and particulars are my diet. We will not stand, Mr. Goodwin. We will sit and make him wish he had selected a different verb." Which, for a start, was good enough for me. The evening consultation. At 7:30 sharp, Lady Ainsley returned to the brownstone with the punctuality of someone who understood that Nero Wolfe's schedule was not a suggestion. Fritz had cleared away the dinner plates, lamb with rosemary that had made the dining room smell like a Mediterranean hillside, and Wolfe had settled into his chair with the satisfied weight of a man whose evening was properly arranged, until the doorbell announced otherwise. I brought her to the office, where she took the red leather chair with less hesitation than she'd shown that morning. The 3 postcards lay spread across Wolfe's desk blotter like evidence at a trial that hadn't started yet. "Miss Ainsley," Wolfe said without preamble, "you will now provide the particulars you omitted this morning." She didn't flinch at the accusation, which scored points with me. "I run Ainsley Curatorial Services. We authenticate and catalogue historical documents and ephemera for estates, museums, and private collectors. Postcards, letters, photographs, paper with stories attached." She gestured toward the cards. 3 weeks ago, I received the first of these." She pointed to a postcard showing the Queensborough Bridge from an angle that made it look like a steel spider web. The message read, "At 4 on Tuesday, a partnership will end because you will not speak." I thought it was someone's idea of a prank. That Tuesday, at 4 precisely, my business partner, Dr. Edmund Thorne, announced he was dissolving our firm. He'd been secretly negotiating to sell our client list and authentication protocols to Meridian Acquisitions, our primary competitor. When he made his announcement, I was so stunned I couldn't find words to object, just as the card predicted. Wolfe's fingers drummed once against his chair arm. Dr. Thorne's field? Art history and document authentication. We'd been partners for 8 years. Her voice carried the particular bitterness reserved for betrayals that arrive wearing familiar faces. The second card came 10 days later. This one showed the old Fulton Fish Market, all weathered brick and morning shadows. The message? At noon on Friday, a reputation will break because you will not look. That Friday, I was scheduled to present authentication findings on a collection of Civil War letters to the Hartwell Foundation, a potential $1 million acquisition. At 11:50, I received an anonymous package containing what appeared to be evidence that the letters were forgeries. Sophisticated forgeries, but forgeries nonetheless. I was so focused on examining the evidence, trying to verify its claims, that I didn't look up when Foundation representatives entered my office. They found me hunched over documents that seemed to prove I'd been about to authenticate fraudulent materials. The presentation was cancelled. My reputation in the authentication community was, as predicted, broken. "And the evidence?" I asked. "Proved to be fabricated, but by then the damage was done. Meridian Acquisitions received the Hartwell contract." She touched the third card. "Our lighthouse friend. This arrived yesterday, identical to yours. Same lighthouse, same message about Thursday at 3 o'clock, same prediction about a man dying because Nero Wolfe will not stand." Wolfe leaned back in his chair, which protested with a familiar creak. "You believe you know the intended victim?" "My brother, Dr. Marcus Ainsley. He's a forensic accountant who's been investigating financial irregularities at Meridian Acquisitions. He's scheduled to present his findings to the State Attorney General's office Thursday afternoon at 2:30. If his evidence is as damning as he believes, Several people could face criminal charges. She paused. Including Edmund Thorne, who's now Meridian's chief authentication officer. The pieces were arranging themselves into a pattern that had the symmetry of deliberate design. Someone had systematically dismantled Leda Ainsley's professional life, positioned themselves to benefit from her downfall, and now apparently planned to eliminate the one person who could expose their methods. "Miss Ainsley," Wolfe said, "you will provide a complete list of everyone who knew your brother's investigation schedule. You will also supply financial records for your former partnership and any correspondence with Dr. Thorne regarding the dissolution." I brought what I could. She opened her handbag and withdrew a manila folder. "But there's something else. Someone's been watching my apartment. A woman, middle-aged, well-dressed. She carries flowers and always stays exactly 30 minutes when she visits the building across the street. The doorman thinks she's visiting a tenant, but when I asked around, no one knew her." That detail had the ring of professional surveillance dressed up as social calls. I made a note to have Saul Panzer take a look at Miss Ainsley's neighborhood. The doorbell chose that moment to announce another visitor. Wolfe's eyes fixed on me with the expression he reserves for interruptions that arrive without invitation. At the front door, I found a man in his 50s with the kind of face that suggested he'd spent years explaining complicated things to people who didn't want to understand them. He wore a gray overcoat and carried a leather briefcase with the practiced grip of someone accustomed to making house calls. "Dr. Edmund Thorne," he said before I could ask. "I believe my former partner is here." I let him in because turning away the prime suspect seemed like poor detective work, even if it meant disturbing Wolfe's carefully arranged evening. In the office, Thorne's eyes swept the room, with the quick assessment of a man cataloging valuable items, then settled on Leda Ainsley with what might have been regret or calculation. "Leda," he said, "I heard you'd engaged a detective. I came to explain." "Explain what?" she asked, her voice carrying enough frost to preserve fish. "Why your brother is going to be disappointed Thursday afternoon." Thorne set his briefcase on the floor and looked directly at Wolfe. "Mr. Wolfe, I assume you've been told about Marcus Ainsley's investigation into Meridian acquisitions. What you haven't been told is that his evidence is based on documents that were altered before he received them. Documents that will prove, under proper forensic examination, to be sophisticated fabrications." Wolfe's expression didn't change, but the quality of his attention sharpened. "You are confessing to document fraud, Dr. Thorne." "I'm confessing to being more thorough than my accusers expected." Thorne's smile had the cold precision of a scalpel. "Marcus Ainsley will present his findings Thursday afternoon. The Attorney General's office will order an independent forensic examination. And when that examination reveals the documents to be forgeries, Mr. Ainsley's reputation will join his sister's in ruins." "And if he doesn't present his findings?" I asked. "Then he lives to authenticate another day." Thorne picked up his briefcase. "Good evening, Mr. Wolfe. Miss Ainsley. I trust Thursday will prove educational for all concerned." After he left, Wolfe sat in silence for a full minute, staring at the postcards as if they might reveal additional secrets under sufficient scrutiny. "Miss Ainsley," he said finally, "your retainer is $25,000. You will pay it now, and you will consider it the best investment you've ever made." "Because you'll save my brother?" "Because," Wolfe said, reaching for the bell to summon Fritz and fresh beer, "I intend to be standing when Dr. Thorne discovers that some games have more players than he counted on." Which, coming from a man who hadn't stood voluntarily in recent memory, was a declaration of war. The Wednesday morning inventory. Wolfe doesn't chase suspects. He collects them like a philatelist arranges stamps. Methodically, with attention to provenance, and with the understanding that the rare ones reveal themselves through patience rather than pursuit. Wednesday morning found him in his chair with the morning beer, the 3 postcards arranged on his desk blotter like evidence in a trial that hadn't started yet, in the expression of a man who had decided that someone's elaborate joke was about to become their expensive mistake. "Miss Ainsley," he said without preamble when I brought her to the office at 10 sharp. You will now provide a complete roster of those whose professional interests intersect with your destruction and your brother's potential demise. Begin with Dr. Thorne's new associates. She settled into the red leather chair with the composed attention of someone who had spent the night organizing her thoughts into categories that made sense. Vivian Kell, she said immediately. Meridian's general counsel and head of strategic acquisitions. She's the one who orchestrated their initial approach to buy us out 2 years ago. When I declined, she made it clear that Meridian doesn't accept no as a permanent condition. I wrote it down. A lawyer who specialized in acquisitions and didn't like being told no had the kind of professional temperament that could turn personal rejection into systematic revenge. Miss Kell's relationship with Dr. Thorne? Wolfe asked. Close. Very close. She recruited him personally, and their partnership at Meridian has been comprehensive. Leda's tone suggested that their collaboration extended beyond office hours. She has a reputation for eliminating obstacles rather than negotiating around them. Who else? Crawford Beckett. She gestured toward the lighthouse postcard. His family endowed that lighthouse. Beckett's Light. He's an antiquarian map dealer with enough money to buy respectability and enough ego to demand it. 2 years ago, he retained us to authenticate a collection of 19th century shipping ledgers supposedly recovered from a Long Island warehouse. Our analysis proved they were sophisticated composites, period paper with modern ink, carefully aged. The forgeries were good enough to fool most collectors, but not good enough to fool us. He took the news badly, I asked. He accused us of destroying a family legacy and suggested our methods were overly rigorous. 6 months later, he joined Meridian's advisory board and began recommending them to other collectors. He also wrote an opinion piece for Antique Trader, questioning whether authentication firms had become too conservative in their standards. Wolfe's fingers drummed once against his chair arm. A man who confuses his wishes with facts. Dangerous when wealthy. Continue. Dr. Julian Vance, Leda said. He runs Vance and Associates, a smaller authentication firm that's been nipping at our heels for years. Julian has the technical skills to create convincing forgeries and the professional jealousy to use them. When the Hartwell Foundation incident occurred, he was the first to call, offering to step in during our difficult period with a rate structure that was suspiciously competitive. That made 3 with clear motives and the means to orchestrate the kind of elaborate scheme we were facing. But the postcard suggested someone with intimate knowledge of both Wolfe's habits and the precise timing of events. That required either exceptional research or inside information. Your former employees, Wolfe said, apparently following the same logic. Who among them possessed comprehensive knowledge of your methods, your clients, and your personal reactions under stress? Leda hesitated. Clara Bellamy. She was our senior research assistant for 8 years. She knew our authentication protocols, our client relationships, our financial arrangements, everything. She resigned abruptly after Edmund announced the partnership dissolution, claiming she needed to reassess her professional priorities. But Clara never made major decisions quickly. She was methodical, careful, almost obsessive about details. Where is Miss Bellamy now? I asked. I don't know. She declined to provide a forwarding address and hasn't responded to calls. Her landlord said she moved out of her apartment 2 weeks ago, paid through the end of the month, and left no forwarding information. That had the sound of someone who had either been paid to disappear or was planning to reappear under different circumstances. I made a note to have Saul Panzer add Clara Bellamy to his research list. And the surveillance, Wolfe said. The woman with flowers. You mentioned her name might be Della Pike. The doorman thought that's what he heard when she introduced herself to someone in the lobby. But when I asked the building manager, no one by that name is registered as a visitor or resident. She appears every few days, always with flowers, always stays exactly 30 minutes, and always positions herself where she can photograph everyone entering or leaving my building. Professional surveillance, I observed. Someone's paying for regular reports on your movements and contacts. Wolfe reached for his beer and considered it as if the foam might contain additional insights. 5 suspects, he said finally. Dr. Thorne, Miss Kell, Mr. Beckett, Dr. Vance, and the absent Miss Bellamy, plus a professional observer whose employment suggests coordination and funding. The pattern indicates not merely individual grievance, but orchestrated campaign. The phone rang, interrupting his analysis. Lon Cohen was calling with information about Meridian acquisitions that made the morning considerably more interesting. "Archie," Lon said, "that company you asked about? Meridian's been busy. They've acquired 3 authentication firms in the past 18 months, always after the original owners suffered some kind of professional embarrassment. Always at below-market prices, always with the same legal counsel handling the transactions." "Vivian Kell?" I asked. "The very same. And here's the kicker. Each of those firms had previously refused acquisition offers from Meridian. Each suffered mysterious scandals involving questioned authentications or professional ethics. Each was subsequently acquired at a fraction of their original value." I thanked Lon and hung up. Wolfe had been listening with the focused attention he reserved for information that confirmed his suspicions. "A pattern," he said with satisfaction. "Miss Kell and Dr. Thorne have refined their methods through practice. The Ainsley firm is not their first acquisition, merely their most recent." "And Marcus?" I asked. "Where does his investigation fit?" "Dr. Marcus Ainsley," Wolfe said, "has apparently uncovered evidence of systematic fraud. His elimination would prevent exposure of their previous acquisitions and clear the path for future ones. The postcards are not merely threats. They are announcements of a schedule that culminates tomorrow at 3 o'clock. The doorbell chose that moment to announce another visitor. Through the one-way glass, I saw a middle-aged woman in an expensive coat, carrying a manila envelope and wearing the kind of determined expression that suggests she'd been rehearsing this conversation. "Miss Vivian Kell," she announced when I opened the door. "I believe you've been asking questions about my company. I thought it might be more efficient to provide answers directly." I led her to the office, where she took the yellow chair with the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling conversations. She was handsome in the way that expensive grooming and careful attention to detail could make anyone handsome, but her eyes had the calculating quality of someone who evaluated people the way an appraiser evaluated objects, for their utility and their vulnerabilities. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, "I understand you've accepted employment from Lady Ainsley. I hope you'll consider the possibility that your client may not have provided you with complete information about her recent difficulties." "Miss Kell," Wolfe replied without moving, "you will state your business or you will leave. I do not accept social calls. My business is preventing unnecessary unpleasantness. Meridian Acquisitions operates in a competitive marketplace. When competitors make accusations they cannot substantiate, it becomes necessary to protect our reputation and our clients' interests." She opened the envelope and withdrew a set of photographs. These were taken outside Miss Ainsley's building over the past 3 weeks. They show her meeting with individuals who have previously made false claims against authentication firms. The photographs showed Leda in conversation with several people I didn't recognize, but the implication was clear enough. Someone had been documenting her activities and was prepared to suggest that she was orchestrating some kind of conspiracy against Meridian. "Interesting," Wolfe said, examining the photographs. "And the photographer. A private investigator retained to document potential harassment of our employees and clients." Vivian Kell's smile had the warmth of winter moonlight. "Della Pike. She's very thorough." That answered one question and raised several others. Della Pike wasn't just watching Leda Ainsley, she was building a case against her. The postcards weren't just threats, they were part of a larger strategy to discredit and eliminate anyone who posed a threat to Meridian's acquisition program. "Miss Kell," Wolfe said, "you have been informative. You may leave now." "I hope you'll consider—" "You may leave now," Wolfe repeated, and something in his tone made it clear that further conversation would not be welcome. After she left, Wolfe sat in silence for a full minute, staring at the postcards as if they might reveal additional secrets under sufficient scrutiny. "Well?" I asked. "Well," he said, reaching for the bell to summon Fritz and fresh beer, "we now understand the scope of their ambitions. Miss Kell and Dr. Thorne have created a systematic method for acquiring competitors through orchestrated scandals. The postcards are their latest refinement, psychological warfare designed to create panic and poor judgment. And tomorrow at 3. Tomorrow at 3, Wolfe said with the satisfaction of a man who had just realized his opponent had made a crucial error. They will discover that some games have more players than they anticipated. And some players, he added, settling back in his chair with finality, refuse to be moved by threats, predictions, or postcards, no matter how cleverly composed. Which, coming from a man who considered standing up an unnecessary concession to gravity, was a declaration that our circle of suspects was about to discover they had seriously underestimated their target. The Wednesday afternoon canvas. The list Wolfe handed me that Wednesday morning had the courtesy to be written in his precise script and the discourtesy to require shoe leather I'd been saving for better weather. It read simply, Post Office, Beckett, Vance, Bellamy's Trail, Pike Confirmation. Below that, in smaller letters that suggested afterthought but meant emphasis, be thorough, be skeptical, be back by 6. I started with Station S because in my experience, anonymous mail begins where stamps meet spite, and whoever was sending postcards with death predictions had chosen their postal district with the same care they'd chosen their lighthouse. The postmarked Trail Station S occupies a corner where Midtown admits it has to work for a living. The morning rush had settled into the afternoon lull, leaving behind a clerk with steel-gray hair and the expression of a man who'd seen every variety of human foolishness pass through his window. I showed him the lighthouse postcard. "Yesterday's mail," I said, wondering about the customer who sent this. He examined it with the practiced eye of someone who'd been asked similar questions before. "Block letters. Careful formation. Not a southpaw, no smearing. Postmark's automatic, so I can't tell you the exact time, but yesterday's batch went through between 11 and 1. He handed it back. "You want to know about the postcard itself?" "I'm listening. Rack over there." He nodded toward a display of vintage New York scenes. "Vendor restocks twice a week. Lighthouse cards like this one. We moved maybe a dozen in the past month. Popular with tourists and locals who think nostalgia's worth $1.50. I bought a Beckett's light card from the rack and studied it. Same lighthouse, same weathered romanticism, same potential for anonymous threats. You remember anyone buying several of these recently?" Middle-aged woman, maybe 3 weeks back. Nice coat, paid cash, bought a dozen mixed scenes. Bridge, pier, lighthouse. Polite. Didn't make conversation. He paused. Had the kind of hands that spend time with paper, soft but careful. Librarian hands, maybe, or someone who works with documents. That description could fit Clara Bellamy, but it could also fit half the women in Manhattan who worked with their minds instead of their backs. I thanked the clerk and headed for Crawford Beckett's establishment, because a man who endows lighthouses and sells history by the sheet should be willing to discuss both. The Map Merchant's Territory. Beckett's cartographical curiosities occupied a narrow building in the village with windows that filtered street noise into something resembling scholarly quiet. Inside, the air carried the scent of old paper and older money. Beckett himself was attending to a customer examining what appeared to be a map of Manhattan when it still had more farms than buildings. When the customer left with his purchase wrapped in tissue paper, Beckett approached me with the practiced smile of a man who'd learned to evaluate potential buyers in the first 30 seconds. "Crawford Beckett," he said, extending a hand. "How may I enrich your understanding of our city's geographical heritage?" "Archie Goodwin, I'm here about postcards, not maps. Specifically, postcards featuring your family's lighthouse." His smile didn't falter, but something shifted behind his eyes, the way water changes when a stone drops through the surface. "Beckett's Light. Yes, it appears on various commercial postcards. The lighthouse belongs to the public now, of course, though our family's name remains attached for historical reasons." I pulled out the threatening postcard and placed it on his counter. "Someone's been using your lighthouse to deliver unpleasant messages." He read it twice, and the second time his face went pale around the edges. "This is disturbing. Who received this?" "A client, along with similar messages that have been proving unfortunately accurate." I watched his reaction carefully. The interesting thing is, whoever sent these knows enough about Nero Wolfe to predict his behavior with considerable precision. I've heard of Mr. Wolfe, naturally. His reputation is formidable. Beckett set the card down as if it might contaminate his merchandise. But I fail to see how this concerns me. Your recent association with Meridian Acquisitions concerns me. Your position on their advisory board, your willingness to work with them after the Ainsley firm questioned your family documents. The Ainsley firm was overly rigid in their authentication standards, Beckett said, his voice taking on the edge of old grievance. They dismissed ledgers that had been in my family for generations, suggested someone had been improving historical documents. It was insulting and professionally damaging. And now Meridian sees things differently. Meridian understands that authentication requires both scientific rigor and historical context. Vivian Kell has been particularly helpful in connecting me with collectors who appreciate that balance. He straightened. As for tomorrow at 3 o'clock, I'll be giving a presentation to the Historical Society, 2 blocks from here, with approximately 20 witnesses. You're welcome to verify. I left him with his alibi and his antique maps, but not before noticing the drafting tools on his workbench. Precise instruments for someone who dealt in straight lines and accurate measurements. The kind of tools that could produce the neat block lettering on our postcards. The competitor's workshop, Dr. Julian Vance's office, occupied the 3rd floor of a building in the garment district, where the hallways smelled of fabric sizing and industrial ambition. His workshop was a study in methodical precision. Clean work benches, calibrated instruments, and filing systems that would have made a Swiss banker weep with envy. Vance himself was a thin man with the kind of mustache that required daily attention and the pale complexion of someone who spent his days under artificial light. He greeted me with the wary courtesy of a man who'd read the morning papers and recognized my name. "Mr. Goodwin, if this concerns Miss Ainsley's recent difficulties, I should mention that my sympathies are purely professional." "Professional sympathies are convenient," I said, examining his workspace. "They don't clutter up your conscience with personal feelings." He didn't smile. "I expose forgeries, Mr. Goodwin. That's my profession and my calling. When competitors make errors in judgment, it creates opportunities for those who maintain higher standards." On his workbench, I noticed a set of technical pens arranged with military precision, and beside them, a stack of index cards with notes written in careful block letters. "You label your work samples by hand. Cursive writing is an affectation. Block letters are legible and professional." He followed my gaze to the cards. "Documentation is essential in authentication work. Every step must be recorded, every conclusion supported by evidence." "Including evidence about your competitors' failures?" "Especially that." His smile had the warmth of January moonlight. The Hartwell Foundation, for instance, was very interested in our documentation of the Ainsley firm's authentication errors. We were able to provide comprehensive analysis of their flawed conclusions. "How comprehensive?" "Comprehensive enough to secure their confidence and their business." He paused. "The Foundation values reliability, Mr. Goodwin. When one authentication firm proves unreliable, they naturally seek alternatives." I left Vance with his technical pens and his professional satisfaction, but not before noticing that his handwriting matched the style of our postcards with uncomfortable precision. The vanished assistant Clara Bellamy's trail led me through a series of increasingly frustrating dead ends. Her former apartment building yielded a superintendent who remembered her as a quiet tenant who paid rent promptly and left without forwarding address. Her favorite bookstore hadn't seen her in weeks. The small cafe where she'd eaten lunch regularly confirmed she'd been a regular customer who'd simply stopped coming. But people don't vanish without leaving traces, especially methodical people who spend their lives creating documentation. I spent 2 hours working through her professional contacts, finally reaching a colleague at the municipal archives who provided the break I needed. Clara mentioned something about a research opportunity on Long Island, the colleague told me. Said it was a chance to work with a significant maritime history collection. She seemed excited, which was unusual for Clara. She wasn't the excitable type. Long Island, like the lighthouse on our postcards. I called Saul Panzer and asked him to canvass research facilities and historical societies on Long Island for recent hires in document authentication. The surveillance confirmation. While Saul worked his methodical magic, I positioned myself across from Lady Ainsley's building to observe Della Pike's afternoon performance. At 4:30 precisely. She appeared carrying a bouquet of white lilies and wearing the kind of unremarkable coat that made her instantly forgettable. I watched her enter the building, position herself near the lobby windows with clear sight lines to the street, and spend exactly 30 minutes photographing everyone who entered or left. Her technique was professional. No obvious camera work, just a woman apparently absorbed in her phone while systematically documenting the building's traffic. When she left, I followed at a discreet distance. She walked 6 blocks to a parking garage, emerged 10 minutes later without the flowers, but carrying a manila envelope, and proceeded directly to Meridian Acquisitions building. She flashed credentials at security and disappeared into the elevator with the confidence of someone who belonged there. The return and synthesis. By 6 o'clock, I was back at the brownstone with a notebook full of observations and the growing conviction that we were facing something more sophisticated than simple revenge. Wolfe was in his chair with the evening beer, the postcards still arranged on his desk like pieces of a puzzle he was solving through pure contemplation. "Report," he said without looking up. I gave him the complete canvas, the post office clerk's description of a woman with librarian hands buying multiple postcards, Beckett's carefully constructed alibi and his drafting tools, Vance's technical precision and block lettering, Clara Bellamy's mysterious relocation to a Long Island research opportunity, and Della Pike's professional surveillance routine ending at Meridian's offices. Wolfe listened without interruption, then sat in silence for a full minute before reaching for his beer. "The pattern emerges," he said finally. "Miss Bellamy procures the materials, Dr. Vance provides the technical expertise, Mr. Beckett supplies the historical legitimacy, and Miss Pike documents the results, all coordinated by Miss Kell and executed with Dr. Thorne's inside knowledge." The phone rang, interrupting his analysis. It was Saul with the confirmation we needed. "Archie," Saul said, "I found Clara Bellamy. She's working at the Beckett Foundation Maritime Research Library in East Hampton. Started there 2 weeks ago as senior archivist, specializing in Long Island lighthouse documentation. The foundation was endowed by Crawford Beckett's grandfather and maintains an extensive collection of vintage postcards, including several dozen images of Beckett's light." I hung up and looked at Wolfe. "So Clara has access to the postcards? Vance has the technical skills to create authentic-looking block lettering. Beckett has the family connection to provide legitimacy, and Pike documents everything from Meridian's files." "Precisely." Wolfe set down his beer with the satisfaction of a man who had just watched his opponent's strategy reveal itself completely. "They have created a systematic method for acquiring competitors through orchestrated scandals, using authentic materials and professional techniques to create convincing evidence of their target's incompetence." "And tomorrow at 3? "Tomorrow at 3, Wolfe said, his eyes fixed on the lighthouse postcard. They expect to complete their campaign with Marcus Ainsley's elimination and our compliance with their psychological manipulation. They believe they have accounted for all variables. Have they? Wolfe's smile had the quality of winter sunrise. Cold, clear, and promising significant changes in the weather. They have accounted for gravity, Mr. Goodwin. They have not accounted for leverage. Tomorrow we shall demonstrate the difference. Which, coming from a man who understood that the most effective movement sometimes involved remaining perfectly still, suggested that Thursday at 3 o'clock was going to provide our opponents with a comprehensive education in the principles of strategic immobility. The Thursday morning violation. There are mornings when you wake up knowing the world has shifted while you slept, even before you can identify what's different. Thursday morning was one of those mornings, and the difference announced itself the moment I entered the office at 8:30 with coffee that was supposed to improve my disposition, but wasn't going to get the chance. The postcards were wrong. Not obviously wrong. Whoever had rearranged them understood subtlety the way a surgeon understands precision. The 3 cards Leda Ainsley had brought were still spread across Wolfe's desk blotter: the Queensborough Bridge, the Fulton Fish Market, and Beckett's Light. But now, there was a 4th card, positioned between the fish market and the lighthouse with the careful placement of someone who wanted their work noticed without being obvious about it. It was another Beckett's Light postcard, nearly identical to the original but subtly different in ways that made my spine itch. The colors were a fraction brighter, the paper stock marginally glosser. It was the card I'd purchased yesterday at Station S, the one I'd slipped into my jacket pocket and left on my desk when I'd reported to Wolfe. Someone had moved it to his desk, positioned it among the evidence like a calling card. The implications hit me with the force of a well-aimed brick. This wasn't random mischief or simple burglary. Someone had been inside the brownstone, inside our office, inside our investigation. They'd touched our evidence, rearranged our materials, and done it all with the confidence of someone who knew they wouldn't be interrupted. I was still staring at the cards when Fritz appeared in the doorway, his face carrying the expression of a man who discovered vandalism in his cathedral. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, his voice tight with controlled outrage, "someone has been in my kitchen." That got my complete attention. Fritz's kitchen was as inviolate as Wolfe's office, protected by locks, habits, and the kind of territorial instinct that would make a guard dog envious. "What kind of someone?" I asked. "The kind who knows where I keep my nutmeg but doesn't know how I arrange my spices." Fritz's jaw worked like he was chewing glass. The jar was moved from its proper position, opened and resealed. There are fingerprints on the lid that are not mine, and a smear of beef tallow on my cutting board that did not come from yesterday's lamb. We went to the kitchen, where Fritz demonstrated his case with the precision of a forensic expert. The nutmeg jar showed clear signs of tampering, fresh fingerprints around the rim, a slight displacement in the spice rack's perfect order, and inside the jar, nestled among the aromatic powder, a small roll of paper. I extracted it with tweezers, unrolled it carefully, and read the message written in the same block letters we'd come to know. The spice of sanctuary is knowing when walls become windows. At 3, gravity conquers pride. "My Hungarian nutmeg," Fritz said with the tone of a man reporting a war crime. "They violated my Hungarian nutmeg to deliver threats." At 9 o'clock sharp, Wolfe descended from the plant rooms and entered the office with his usual measured precision. He took one look at the 4 postcards on his desk, then at my face, then at Fritz hovering in the doorway with barely contained fury. "Report," he said, settling into his chair with the deliberate care of a man who is about to declare war. I laid it out systematically, the 4th postcard appearing overnight, the kitchen violation, the nutmeg message, the evidence of professional entry without forced locks or broken windows. Wolfe listened without interruption, his eyes fixed on the postcards, his fingers drumming a slow, ominous rhythm against his chair arm. When I finished, he sat in silence for a full minute, staring at the evidence of violation with the expression of a man who'd been personally insulted by someone who'd seriously underestimated the consequences. "Fritz," he said finally, "you will change every lock in this house today. Mr. Panzer will provide recommendations and supervision. You will also prepare a complete inventory of everyone who has had access to keys, including service personnel, delivery staff, and former employees." "Yes, sir," Fritz said with grim satisfaction. "Archie, you will call Mr. Panzer immediately. He will position himself where he can observe all approaches to the brownstone from 2:30 until 4 this afternoon. You will also call Mr. Durkin and Mr. Cather. Mr. Durkin will maintain surveillance on Miss Kell's offices. Mr. Cather will observe Dr. Vance's workshop." I reached for the phone, but Wolfe held up a hand. "First, we will receive Dr. Marcus Ainsley. He called while you were examining Fritz's nutmeg. He will be here in 10 minutes with information that apparently changes the nature of his presentation this afternoon." The doorbell announced Marcus Ainsley's arrival with punctual precision. I brought him to the office, where he took the red leather chair with the careful movements of a man carrying explosive information. "Mr. Wolfe," he said without preamble, "the documents I've been analyzing for my presentation, they've been systematically altered. Subtly, professionally, but altered nonetheless. If I present them as evidence of fraud this afternoon, I'll be presenting fraudulent evidence myself." "The alterations," Wolfe said, "were performed by someone with access to your files and knowledge of your investigation methods. Clara Bellamy had complete access to our authentication protocols and filing systems, but Clara's not sophisticated enough to orchestrate something this complex." Marcus rubbed his eyes. "However, she could have provided the intelligence necessary for someone else to execute the alterations." I made the call to Saul, who answered on the first ring as if he'd been waiting. "Saul," I said, "we need immediate surveillance on the brownstone and coordination with Fred and Ori for coverage of our suspects. Also, I need you to check something about Clara Bellamy's current location." "Already ahead of you," Saul said. "I've been watching the Beckett Foundation Maritime Research Library. It's been closed for renovations all week, but yesterday evening someone was there. Lights on, car in the parking lot until nearly midnight. The car belongs to Della Pike. This morning, I followed Pike from the library to a locksmith shop in Queens, where she returned what appeared to be key-making equipment. That explained the entry method. Pike had used Clara's intelligence about our security routines to identify vulnerabilities, then created the means to exploit them. The violation of the brownstone wasn't random, it was reconnaissance and psychological warfare combined. "Mr. Ainsley," Wolfe said after I'd relayed Saul's information, "you will keep your appointment this afternoon. You will present your findings exactly as scheduled. But if the documents are fraudulent, then their fraudulent nature will be exposed, but not in the manner their creators intended." Wolfe's eyes fixed on the clock above his desk. "At 3 o'clock this afternoon, I will be in this chair, as predicted. You will be presenting altered evidence to the Attorney General's office, and our uninvited visitors will discover that some violations strengthen rather than weaken their intended victims." After Marcus left, I looked at Wolfe. "You're going to let him present fraudulent documents?" "I'm going to let him present documents that have been revealed as fraudulent," Wolfe corrected. "The distinction is crucial. By 3 o'clock, the Attorney General's office will understand exactly how those documents were altered, by whom, and for what purpose. And the violation of the brownstone." Wolfe's smile had the quality of winter moonlight, cold, clear, and promising significant consequences for anyone who'd mistaken his sanctuary for an easy target. "The violation of the brownstone," he said, reaching for the bell to summon Fritz and fresh beer, "was their greatest tactical error. They believed they could intimidate me by demonstrating access to my private domain. Instead, they have provided me with evidence of their methods, confirmation of their coordination, and justification for measures they will find considerably more uncomfortable than a rearranged spice rack." The phone rang again. This time it was Long Cohen with news that made the morning's violations part of a larger, more disturbing pattern. "Archie," Lon said. "You asked me to check on other authentication firms that had been acquired by Meridian. I found something interesting. Each firm reported similar incidents before their acquisition. Subtle security breaches, evidence tampering, psychological pressure, always preceded by anonymous messages predicting specific outcomes. Postcards. Different methods, but same pattern. Anonymous predictions that proved accurate, followed by professional disasters that made acquisition inevitable." Lon paused. "There's also been a recent uptick in locksmith burglaries in the neighborhoods of firms currently resisting Meridian's acquisition offers." I hung up and looked at Wolfe. "It's systematic. They've refined their methods through practice." "Indeed." Wolfe leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man who just watched his opponent reveal their entire strategy. "Miss Kell and Dr. Thorne have created a comprehensive system for eliminating competition through orchestrated scandals, using inside intelligence and professional techniques to create convincing evidence of their target's incompetence." "And the 3 o'clock deadline?" "The 3 o'clock deadline," Wolfe said, his eyes fixed on the 4 postcards spread across his desk, "represents their confidence that they have accounted for all variables. They expect Marcus Ainsley to present fraudulent evidence, destroying his credibility and eliminating the threat to their operations. They expect me to remain in this chair, fulfilling their prediction and confirming their psychological assessment. Will you?" "I will be exactly where they expect me to be," Wolfe said with finality. "And when their predictions prove accurate, they will discover that some games have more players than their architects anticipated, and some victories are more expensive than their winners can afford." The clock above his desk showed 10:30, 4.5 hours until the predicted crisis, and Wolfe appeared to be planning to meet it with the same immobility that had frustrated criminals and clients for decades, which, knowing Wolfe's capacity for turning apparent weakness into devastating strength, probably meant that 3 o'clock was going to provide our opponents with a comprehensive education in the difference between predicting behavior and controlling consequences. The brownstone had been violated, but the violation had revealed more about our enemies than they'd learned about us. And in Nero Wolfe's universe, that kind of tactical error rarely went unpunished. The tightening noose. Thursday afternoon arrived with the deliberate menace of a creditor who's tired of sending polite notices. By noon, the brownstone had acquired the atmosphere of a fortress under siege, though the siege was being conducted with postcards, telephone calls, and the kind of professional surveillance that makes honest citizens feel like they're living in someone else's nightmare. The escalation began at 12:30 with a hand-delivered envelope bearing Wolfe's name in the same block letters we'd grown to know and dislike. Inside was another postcard, Beckett's light again, with a message that had abandoned subtlety for direct threat. At 3, as promised, gravity conquers all. Tucked behind it was a glossy photograph taken through our office window, showing me at my desk the previous evening, unaware that someone with a camera and considerable nerve had been documenting our private moments. "Miss Pike's portfolio expands," Wolfe observed, examining the photograph with the detached interest of a man studying evidence of his opponent's overconfidence. "She has graduated from flowers to photography. The progression suggests desperation disguised as intimidation." At 1:15, the pressure acquired an official dimension when Inspector Kramer called with news that made the morning's violations look like practice exercises. "Wolfe," he said without preamble, "I've got a complaint from the Attorney General's office about anonymous threats involving state witnesses and predictions about failed testimony. Your name came up in connection with postcards and a forensic accountant named Marcus Ainsley. You want to explain why I'm hearing about this from downtown instead of from you?" I looked at Wolfe, who had set down his beer with the careful precision of a man who just realized his lunch was going to be interrupted by something more serious than poor seasoning. "Inspector," Wolfe said, taking the phone, "you're about to become involved in a case of systematic fraud, professional intimidation, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The postcards are merely the visible portion of an enterprise that has been operating with considerable success until today. What kind of enterprise? The kind that acquires competitors by destroying their reputations through orchestrated scandals, using inside intelligence and professional techniques to create convincing evidence of incompetence. Wolfe gestured toward the postcards. Dr. Marcus Ainsley was scheduled to present evidence of their methods to the Attorney General at 2:30 this afternoon. The postcards predict his failure because they intend to ensure it. Before Kramer could respond, the phone rang on my line. It was Marcus himself, and his voice carried the controlled panic of a man who just discovered that his careful plans were being systematically dismantled. "Archie," he said, "they've moved my presentation to a smaller, more secure room, 2 officials instead of 5, and they've introduced a consulting expert to review my documents for authenticity, Dr. Lisette Harmon. I know her work. She's done forensic analysis for Julian Vance. Do not let her handle your documents unsupervised," Wolfe instructed. "Insist on video documentation of the entire session. If they refuse, offer to postpone while you consult your attorney." "Which attorney?" Marcus asked. "Me," Wolfe said, and the single syllable carried enough authority to make it legally binding in any court that valued competence over credentials. At 1:45, the siege acquired a visual component when a white van with City Communications Maintenance painted on its side took up residence across the street. 2 men emerged, wearing the universal uniform of municipal employees, navy jackets, clipboards, and the kind of purposeful movement that would convince anyone who wasn't looking closely. I was looking closely. Through the one-way glass, I watched them conduct a survey of utility poles that would have fooled most observers, except for the small detail that they spent more time watching our building than examining any actual infrastructure. Saul's text arrived within minutes. "Van plates rented yesterday. Occupants have law enforcement training but private sector employment. Suggest non-engagement." At 2 o'clock, the men with clipboards approached our door. "Good afternoon, sir," the taller one said when I answered. "We're here to test your telephone lines. We've had reports of intermittent service issues on this block." "The only intermittent service we experience involves the postal system," I told him. "What's your supervisor's name?" "Barclay," he said without hesitation. "Spell it." He spelled it Barcley, which told me everything I needed to know about the authenticity of his municipal employment. I closed the door with the polite firmness of a man declining to purchase insurance from strangers, then watched through the glass as they retreated to their van and made a phone call that lasted exactly 90 seconds. "Reconnaissance," Wolfe observed when I reported the encounter. "They wish to observe our security arrangements and assess our state of alert." The misspelling was either carelessness or deliberate, a test to determine whether we would challenge obvious deception. At 2:15, Marcus called again, his voice tight with suppressed alarm. "They want to proceed without video recording for everyone's comfort. Dr. Harmon says chain of custody documentation is excessively formalistic for a preliminary review. And there's something else. Edmund Thorne just arrived at the building. He's been admitted to the secure floor as a consulting expert on document authentication." "Then you will insist on proper procedure," Wolfe said. "You will state that you are under specific legal instruction to maintain complete documentation of the review process. You will not be bullied by appeals to informality or professional courtesy." At 2:25, Fred Durkin called from his surveillance post outside Meridian Acquisitions. "Vivian Kell just left the building with a briefcase and a manila envelope. She's heading toward the government district, moving fast, and she's got company, Crawford Beckett. They're traveling together in Kell's car." The convergence was beginning. All the principal players were moving toward the Attorney General's office, drawn by the promise of witnessing Marcus Ainsley's professional destruction and the completion of their carefully orchestrated campaign. "They cannot resist the spectacle," Wolfe observed with satisfaction. "The truly arrogant must witness their victories in person, which provides us with the tactical advantage of knowing where they will be at the crucial moment." At 2:30, the exact time of Marcus's original appointment, the phone rang with the news that confirmed our opponent's confidence in their methods. "Mr. Wolfe," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the circumstances, "they've just informed me that my presentation has been enhanced by the addition of independent analysis provided by Meridian Acquisitions consulting experts. Apparently, they've submitted comprehensive documentation proving that my evidence consists of sophisticated forgeries designed to implicate innocent parties in non-existent crimes." "And your response?" "I told them I welcomed the opportunity to have my evidence subjected to the most rigorous analysis available, and that I was confident it would withstand any scrutiny they cared to apply." There was a pause. Was that the right approach? "It was the perfect approach," Wolfe said with the satisfaction of a chess player who just watched his opponent move exactly as predicted. "You have accepted their challenge and raised the stakes. They must now prove their allegations or face exposure of their methods." The clock above Wolfe's desk showed 2:45. 15 minutes until the predicted crisis, and the office had acquired the charged atmosphere of a courtroom waiting for a verdict. Wolfe sat in his chair with the immobility of a man who understood that the most effective action sometimes involved remaining perfectly still, while his opponents exhausted themselves against his apparent passivity. "The final convergence approaches," he said, reaching for his beer with the unhurried precision of a man who had calculated every angle and found them all satisfactory. "At 3 o'clock, Dr. Ainsley will present his evidence, our opponents will present their counter-evidence, and the Attorney General's office will discover that some games have more players than their architects anticipated." The doorbell chose that moment to announce a visitor. Through the one-way glass, I saw Inspector Kramer on the stoop, wearing his overcoat and the expression of a man who had spent the afternoon receiving reports that had steadily increased his blood pressure. I brought him to the office, where he took the red leather chair with the controlled movements of someone who was working very hard not to lose his temper in advance of the evidence. "Wolfe," he said, "I've got 3 squad cars positioned around the Attorney General's building, plainclothes detectives in the lobby, and a surveillance team documenting everyone who enters or leaves the secure floors. If this turns out to be some elaborate game you've been playing while real crimes were being committed, I will personally ensure that your next case involves explaining your methods to a grand jury." "Inspector," Wolfe said with the calm certainty of a man who held all the necessary cards, "in approximately 10 minutes you will have evidence of conspiracy, fraud, extortion, and obstruction of justice. The only question remaining is whether our opponents will attempt to complete their scheme or abandon it when they realize they have been outmaneuvered." The clock's minute hand moved with deliberate precision toward the 12. 3 o'clock was no longer approaching. It was arriving, second by second, carrying with it the resolution of a campaign that had begun with anonymous postcards and was about to end with the kind of comprehensive exposure that would make the morning papers and the evening news. Wolfe looked at the 4 postcards spread across his desk, then at the clock, then at me with the expression of a man who was about to demonstrate that some predictions were more accurate than their authors had intended. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a general who just watched the enemy march into the trap he'd spent weeks preparing, "it is time to discover whether our opponents' confidence in their methods exceeds their ability to execute them under pressure. The hour of reckoning has arrived, and I believe we are prepared to provide them with a comprehensive education in the consequences of underestimating their opposition." The clock struck 3, and somewhere across the city, Marcus Ainsley was walking into a room where the future of Meridian Acquisitions and the fate of everyone who'd participated in their systematic campaign of professional destruction was about to be decided by the simple expedient of letting the truth speak for itself, which, in Nero Wolfe's universe, was often the most devastating weapon available. The hour of reckoning. The minute hand on the office clock reached straight up at 3 precisely, and the room acquired the charged atmosphere of a courtroom waiting for a verdict that would rearrange several lives. Wolfe sat in his chair with the immobility of a monument, exactly where the postcards had predicted he would be, proving once again that the most devastating response to threats sometimes involved refusing to be moved by them. The phone rang at 3:02. Marcus Ainsley's voice carried the controlled tension of a man walking into a room full of people who expected to watch him destroy himself professionally. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, "I'm in the Attorney General's conference room. Present are Deputy Attorney General Patricia Walsh, Dr. Lisette Harmon as forensic consultant, and, unexpectedly, Vivian Kell, Edmund Thorne, and Crawford Beckett as expert witnesses for Meridian Acquisitions." "Proceed exactly as we discussed," Wolfe instructed, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a general who'd spent weeks preparing for this particular battle. "Present your evidence methodically. When they challenge its authenticity, welcome their analysis with enthusiasm." I activated the speakerphone so Kramer could follow the proceedings. The inspector sat forward with the focused attention of a man who was beginning to understand that he was witnessing something considerably more sophisticated than the usual collection of grudges and misunderstandings. At 3:04, my direct line buzzed. Saul Panzer's voice was crisp with professional satisfaction. "Archie, Della Pike just entered the building through the service entrance. She's wearing maintenance coveralls and carrying what appears to be a squeeze bottle. She's heading for the north stairwell, the one Marcus would use to exit after his presentation." "Inspector," Wolfe said without moving, "you will instruct Mr. Stebbins to examine the north stairwell immediately. He is to look for a dull sheen on the stair treads and handrail. He will smell beef tallow. He is not to touch anything, but to secure the area and photograph the evidence." Kramer barked the instructions into his phone with the efficiency of a man who'd learned to trust Wolfe's seemingly impossible deductions. The response came back within minutes. Tallow on the second and third treads, a greasy smear on the handrail at hand height, and a woman in maintenance coveralls attempting to clean the evidence with a cloth. "Detain her," Wolfe said. "Do not allow her to wash her hands or dispose of the cloth. The bottle in her pocket contains rendering fat, an effective lubricant for creating fatal accidents on polished stairs." From the speaker phone, Marcus's voice continued with the methodical precision we'd rehearsed. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm presenting evidence of systematic fraud in Meridian Acquisitions business practices. However, I should note that preliminary analysis suggests some of these documents may have been altered since my initial collection." Vivian Kell's voice cut through with silk-wrapped steel. "Mr. Ainsley, we've conducted our own analysis. Dr. Harmon will confirm that your materials contain sophisticated forgeries designed to implicate Meridian in criminal activity." "That's fascinating," Marcus replied, and I could hear the controlled satisfaction in his voice. "Because I agree completely with that assessment. The documents have been systematically altered. The question is, who altered them, when, and for what purpose?" The silence that followed was the sound of a carefully constructed trap snapping shut with mathematical precision. At 3:12, Fred Durkin's voice crackled through my direct line. "Julian Vance just entered Meridian's building with a portable document scanner and a briefcase full of what looks like authentication equipment. He's been admitted to the executive floors. Dr. Vance is creating additional evidence to support their position," Wolfe observed with the detached interest of a chess master watching his opponent make a predicted move. "While the principals are occupied downtown, he will be manufacturing the final pieces of their defense. Unfortunately for him, we anticipated this development." Back on the speaker phone, Marcus was explaining our precautions with the patient thoroughness of a professor conducting a demonstration. "Working with Mr. Wolfe's associates, we created comprehensive photographic and digital records of all original documents before beginning analysis. We also secured independent copies from their original sources using proper chain-of-custody procedures. What Dr. Harmon has been analyzing are the altered versions that were substituted for the originals." Dr. Harmon's voice carried the edge of someone who just realized she'd been manipulated. Mr. Ainsley, are you prepared to present these alleged originals for comparison? Absolutely. They're being delivered by courier as we speak, along with forensic analysis showing exactly how and when the alterations were made. At 3:18, Ori Cather called from his position outside Vance's workshop. The shredder's running overtime. I can see paper confetti through the window. Want me to intervene? Let it continue, Wolfe said with satisfaction. Paper destruction will not help them if the machine's usage log is retrieved. Modern shredders maintain digital records of their operation. The conference call continued with the methodical precision of a demolition conducted by experts. Marcus presented authenticated originals. Dr. Harmon compared them with the altered versions. The differences became undeniable, then damning, then prosecutorial. The alterations, Dr. Harmon announced with professional reluctance, show consistent technical characteristics. The overlay ink contains micro-resin particulates consistent with specialty printers, specifically the Scriptore 500 series. The paper modifications show tool marks consistent with precision instruments used in cartographical work. Crawford Beckett's voice went thin. I don't understand what that has to do with— Mr. Beckett, Marcus interrupted. Your drafting tools and Dr. Vance's technical equipment created these forgeries. The question is whether you were willing participants or merely provided the means. At 3:25, Clara Bellamy's voice joined the conference call with the nervous precision of someone delivering rehearsed lines. I'm here to testify about Mr. Ainsley's investigation methods. He asked me to alter documents to support his allegations. Miss Bellamy, Marcus said with the patient tone of someone who'd been expecting exactly this accusation. Would you be willing to submit to fingerprint analysis of the documents in question? The silence that followed was the sound of a conspiracy, discovering that its most trusted insider had become its most dangerous liability. Miss Bellamy's fingerprints, Dr. Harmon announced after a brief examination, do not appear on any of these documents. However, we have clear prints from Dr. Vance and partial prints consistent with Mr. Beckett's known samples. Wolfe reached for his beer with the satisfied precision of a chess master who'd achieved checkmate in the exact number of moves he'd calculated. Inspector Kramer, he said, you may now coordinate with the Attorney General's office to secure arrests for conspiracy, fraud, extortion, and attempted murder. The evidence is comprehensive, and the confessions are about to become inevitable. At 3:30, Deputy Attorney General Walsh's voice came through the speaker with the authority of someone who just watched a criminal enterprise collapse in real time. Mr. Wolfe, we'll need complete documentation of your investigation methods and all supporting evidence. Mr. Goodwin will provide comprehensive files within the hour, Wolfe replied. You will find our methods scrupulously legal and our documentation exhaustively complete. After the call ended, Kramer looked at Wolfe with the expression of a man who just witnessed a masterclass in strategic patience. You never moved from that chair. I never needed to move from this chair, Wolfe corrected. The postcards predicted that a man would die at 3 o'clock because I would not stand. They were correct about the timing and my posture. They were incorrect about the identity of the victim. At 3 o'clock precisely, the criminal enterprise of Meridian Acquisitions died because I remained exactly where intelligence and preparation made movement unnecessary. The clock showed 3:35. In 35 minutes, an elaborate conspiracy that had taken months to construct had been completely dismantled by the simple expedient of letting its architects demonstrate their methods under controlled conditions while we documented every step of their process. Tonight, Wolfe said, reaching for the bell to summon Fritz and fresh beer, we will invite the surviving participants to join us for a comprehensive review of their methods and motivations. They will come believing they can still salvage their situation through explanation or intimidation. They will discover that some conversations are more educational than others, which, in Nero Wolfe's universe, was a promise that the evening's entertainment would provide our guests with a thorough understanding of why threatening a man who refused to stand was considerably more dangerous than threatening one who might be moved by fear, predictions, or postcards, no matter how cleverly composed. The brownstone had been violated, but the violation had revealed more about our enemies than they'd learned about us. And the most effective response to their elaborate scheme had been exactly what it always was in Wolfe's world: the strategic application of intelligence, patience, and the kind of immobility that made movement not just unnecessary, but tactically superior to any action they could have anticipated. The evening tribunal, Thursday evening, arrived at the brownstone with the ceremonial weight of a court convening for final judgment. Fritz had spent the afternoon restoring order with the methodical precision of a man whose sanctuary had been violated and would not be again. New locks gleamed on every door. The kitchen had been scrubbed to surgical standards, and the office had been arranged with the kind of attention to detail that suggested this evening's proceedings would be remembered by everyone present. The 4 postcards lay in a neat stack on Wolfe's desk. 3 originals and the calling card our uninvited visitors had planted among them. Evidence of hubris masquerading as psychological warfare, now serving as exhibits in their own prosecution. At 7:30 sharp, the gathering began with the punctuality of a Swiss timepiece. Inspector Kramer arrived first, carrying files that represented the afternoon's arrests and the kind of documentation that would make prosecutors happy for months. He took the yellow chair with the satisfaction of a man who'd watched a complex case resolve itself through methodical police work guided by superior intelligence. "We've got Pike and Vance in custody," he reported. "Pike's singing like a canary with a guilty conscience. Vance is demanding a lawyer and claiming he was just following orders. Bellamy's cooperating fully in exchange for immunity." "And our primary architects?" Wolfe inquired, settling into his chair with the deliberate precision of a judge taking the bench. "On their way," Kramer said. "They think they're here for damage control. They're about to discover they're here for sentencing." Leda and Marcus Ainsley arrived together, carrying the relieved exhaustion of people whose professional lives had been restored from the edge of destruction. Marcus had emerged from the Attorney General's office with his reputation intact and his evidence accepted. Leda had already received calls from former clients interested in resuming authentication services. At 7:45, the doorbell announced the arrival we'd been orchestrating since morning. Through the one-way glass, I watched Vivian Kell and Edmund Thorne approach with the careful composure of people who believed they could still control the narrative through superior preparation and professional intimidation. I brought them to the office, where they surveyed the assembled company with the calculating attention of generals assessing unfavorable terrain. Kell's briefcase suggested she'd come prepared for negotiation. Thorne's expression suggested he'd come prepared for confrontation. Both were about to discover they'd prepared for the wrong kind of meeting. "Miss Kell, Dr. Thorne," Wolfe said without rising, "you will be seated. This evening you will provide explanations, not negotiations." They took the red leather chairs with the wary precision of people entering territory they couldn't quite evaluate. Kell maintained her silk-wrapped authority, but something in her eyes suggested she was beginning to understand that her carefully constructed world was about to be systematically dismantled. "Mr. Wolfe," she began, "I understand there have been some unfortunate misunderstandings about Meridian's business practices." "Miss Kell," Wolfe replied with the patient tone of a professor, correcting a fundamental error, "there have been no misunderstandings. There has been comprehensive documentation of systematic fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. You are here because your methods have been exposed, your associates have been arrested, and your enterprise has been dismantled with the kind of thoroughness that leaves no room for misinterpretation." The silence that followed was the sound of a defense strategy collapsing in real time. The systematic revelation. Wolfe reached for his beer with the unhurried precision of a man who held all the necessary cards and intended to play them methodically. "Your scheme, Miss Kell, was both sophisticated and fundamentally flawed. You identified authentication firms unwilling to sell, orchestrated professional embarrassments to weaken them, acquired their assets at below-market prices, and laundered the enterprise through apparent respectability. He gestured toward the postcards. The lighthouse cards were your signature, anonymous predictions that created psychological pressure while demonstrating your supposed omniscience. Crawford Beckett's family connection provided historical legitimacy. Clara Bellamy's inside knowledge provided operational intelligence. Dr. Vance's technical expertise provided the forged materials. Miss Pike's surveillance provided security and enforcement. "You can't prove any direct connection," Kell began. "Miss Kell," Wolfe interrupted, "we have documented every aspect of your operation with the kind of precision that would impress a Swiss banker. Financial records showing payments to Pike's surveillance company. Technical analysis proving Vance created the forged documents using his Scriptore 500 printer with its distinctive micro-resin particulates. Testimony from Bellamy describing her role in intelligence gathering. Physical evidence linking Beckett's cartographical tools to the document alterations." Thorne's composure began to crack. "This is circumstantial. You're constructing a conspiracy from coincidences." "Dr. Thorne," I said, consulting my notes. "At 3:04 this afternoon, Della Pike was arrested while applying beef tallow to stairway treads that Marcus Ainsley would have used after his presentation. She was carrying identification, linking her to Meridian Acquisitions and a squeeze bottle containing additional rendering fat. The substance was applied in a pattern specifically designed to cause fatal falls." The color drained from Thorne's face. "I never authorized—" "You authorized the reconnaissance," Wolfe said with finality. "Miss Pike's invoices, approved by your signature, include entries for brownstone reconnaissance and AG building egress study. The progression from surveillance to sabotage was inevitable once you committed to eliminating Marcus Ainsley's threat to your operation." The individual reckonings. Wolfe's eyes fixed on each conspirator in turn, delivering judgment with the precision of a surgeon removing diseased tissue. "Dr. Vance, your workshop contained the shredded remains of authentication materials going back 2 years. Your printer's memory banks recorded the creation of every forged overlay. Your pride in technical precision became the signature that identified your work." "I was providing consulting services," Vance protested weakly. "I had no knowledge of criminal intent." "You had comprehensive knowledge of criminal results," Wolfe countered. "Your firm's growth aligned precisely with the orchestrated downfall of Meridian's competitors. Ignorance of intent does not excuse participation in execution." "Mr. Beckett," Wolfe continued, "your family's lighthouse provided more than nostalgic imagery. It provided legitimacy, historical gravitas, and access to the materials necessary for creating convincing period postcards. Your drafting tools created the micro-guides for overlay alignment. Your partial fingerprints authenticated your participation." Beckett clutched his briefcase like a shield. "I was told it was historical research, a kind of academic exercise. An exercise that systematically destroyed your competitors and enriched your new associates," Wolfe observed. "Your willingness to participate was purchased with flattery about your family's historical significance and promises of enhanced professional status." The final confrontation. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Kell with the intensity of a judge delivering a capital sentence. "Miss Kell, your fundamental error was assuming that predicting my behavior was equivalent to controlling the outcome. You believed my immobility was weakness rather than strategic advantage. You failed to understand that a man who refuses to be moved by threats often possesses the resources to dismantle the threats themselves. The postcards predicted that a man would die at 3 o'clock because I would not stand," he continued with satisfaction. "They were entirely correct about the timing and my posture. They were incorrect about the identity of the victim. Your criminal enterprise died precisely on schedule because I remained exactly where intelligence and preparation made movement not just unnecessary, but tactically superior to any action you could have anticipated." Kell's composure finally shattered. "You destroyed everything we built, years of careful planning, systematic execution. You destroyed yourselves. Wolfe corrected. "By violating this house, by threatening its occupants, by assuming that elaborate psychological warfare could substitute for sound judgment. Your postcards were not predictions. They were confessions written in advance." Thorne broke completely. "She orchestrated everything. Kell planned every detail. I just followed her instructions." "Dr. Thorne," Wolfe said with contempt, "your eagerness to betray your co-conspirator is exceeded only by your willingness to betray your profession. You dissolved a partnership while negotiating its sale. You offered expertise to the Attorney General while building the defects you meant to expose. Your ethics are a palimpsest, erased and overwritten until the original purpose is illegible." The Resolution Inspector Kramer stood with the authority of a man who'd heard enough explanation and was ready to proceed with justice. "Vivian Kell, Edmund Thorne, you're both under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, extortion, and accessory to attempted murder. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly recommend you exercise that right until you can arrange competent legal counsel." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Kell looked at Wolfe with the expression of someone who'd just realized that her carefully constructed world had been dismantled by a man who'd never left his chair. "How?" she asked. "Miss Kell," Wolfe replied with the patient tone of a teacher explaining elementary principles, "you attempted to intimidate someone whose greatest strength is his refusal to be moved by intimidation. You violated the sanctuary of someone whose power comes from the strategic application of immobility. And you underestimated the intelligence of someone who understands that the most devastating victories are often achieved by remaining exactly where your opponents expect you to be, while they exhaust themselves against your apparent passivity." The aftermath. After Kramer led them away, the office settled into the satisfied quiet that follows the successful conclusion of a complex case. The borrowed chairs were returned to the front room. The postcards were filed as evidence. The brownstone resumed its proper state of sanctuary. "Satisfactory," Wolfe observed, reaching for the bell to summon Fritz and announce dinner. "The violation of this house has been answered. The threats have been neutralized. The predictions have been fulfilled in ways their authors never intended." "And the postcards?" I asked. "The postcards," Wolfe said with finality, "served their purpose perfectly. They predicted that a man would die at 3 o'clock because I would not stand. They were entirely accurate. The criminal enterprise of Meridian Acquisitions died precisely on schedule because I remained exactly where intelligence and preparation made movement not just unnecessary, but the most effective response to their elaborate scheme." Fritz appeared in the doorway with the announcement that dinner was served. Lamb with rosemary and a wine selected to complement the evening's successful conclusion. Justice had been served with the kind of precision that made both dinner and sleep considerably more satisfying, which, in Nero Wolfe's universe, was both the resolution of the case and a comprehensive lesson in why threatening a man who understood the strategic value of immobility was considerably more dangerous than threatening someone who might be moved by fear, predictions, or postcards, no matter how cleverly composed or ominously delivered. The lighthouse had warned of danger, as lighthouses do, but this time the warning had illuminated the rocks on which the senders had wrecked themselves. The complete unraveling. Friday morning arrived at the brownstone with the kind of clarity that follows a successful storm. Damage assessed, repairs completed, and the landscape permanently altered. The morning papers carried headlines that would make prosecutors smile and defense attorneys reach for stronger coffee. Authentication, fraud ring exposed. Postcard predictions lead to criminal conspiracy arrests. The office had been restored to its proper state of sanctuary, with new locks gleaming in Fritz's kitchen, scrubbed to surgical standards. At 10 o'clock sharp, the surviving participants gathered for what had become the final examination, the moment when Wolfe would demonstrate exactly how much he had understood from the beginning and how little his opponents had comprehended about the game they were playing. Leda and Marcus Ainsley occupied the red leather chairs with the relieved composure of people whose professional lives had been restored from systematic destruction. Clara Bellamy sat in the yellow chair, wearing the careful humility of someone who discovered that cooperation was considerably more comfortable than conspiracy. Inspector Kramer positioned himself near the door with the satisfied attention of a man watching loose ends tie themselves into prosecutorial packages. The systematic method exposed. "Miss Bellamy," Wolfe began without preamble, settling into his chair with judicial authority, "you will now provide the complete chronology of Meridian's acquisition strategy, including your role in what Miss Kell termed predictive pressure tools." Clara's voice carried the nervous precision of someone delivering rehearsed testimony. "It began 18 months ago when Vivian Kell recruited me through what she called a professional development opportunity. Initially, I provided reports on our client relationships and authentication protocols for $5,000. When I realized the true pattern, that firms I'd reported on were systematically destroyed and acquired, my compensation increased to $15,000 per month, along with documentation of my previous cooperation that made discontinuing impossible. The postcards, Wolfe continued, were psychological warfare disguised as supernatural insight. Explain their development. Kell called them instruments of controlled prophecy, Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Each prediction was guaranteed because we were orchestrating the events. The Queensborough Bridge card predicted the partnership would end because I would not speak. But Kell knew exactly when Edmund would announce the dissolution because she'd been coordinating with him for weeks. My silence was scripted, not predicted. Marcus leaned forward with the focused attention of someone whose near-death experience was finally making complete sense. "And the fish market card about my sister's reputation? We provided the fabricated evidence about the Civil War letters precisely 50 minutes before her presentation," Clara explained. "The timing guaranteed she'd be absorbed in analysis when the Foundation representatives arrived. Her failure to look up was orchestrated, not predicted." The technical evidence. Wolfe reached for his beer with the deliberate precision of a chess master preparing to demonstrate checkmate. The technical execution required specific expertise and equipment. Dr. Vance provided the forged materials using his Scripture 500 printer. The micro-resin particulates are distinctive. Under magnification, the block letters show consistent burred edges from a well-worn 0.3 millimeter technical pen. Dr. Vance labels everything with obsessive precision, including what he believes will never be examined. I consulted my notes. Vance's workshop contained shredded materials going back 2 years, but the machine's memory banks recorded every forged overlay. His pride in technical precision became the signature that identified his work. Mr. Beckett's contribution was equally traceable, Wolfe continued. His cartographical tools created the micro-guides for overlay alignment. His partial fingerprints authenticated his participation. The Lighthouse postcards came from his family foundation's collection, providing both materials and historical legitimacy. Kramer grunted with professional satisfaction. And Pike's surveillance operation provided the coordination and enforcement. Her invoices, approved by Thorne's signature, included entries for brownstone reconnaissance and AG building egress study. The progression from surveillance to attempted murder was documented in their own billing records. The psychological manipulation. Their fundamental error, Wolfe observed, his eyes fixed on the empty space where the postcards had been arranged, was assuming that predicting my behavior was equivalent to controlling outcomes. They observed that I rarely stand, concluded that I would not stand, and built their psychological warfare around that prediction. "But you never moved from that chair," Marcus said, understanding dawning in his voice. "Precisely. They believed my immobility was weakness rather than strategic advantage. The postcards predicted that a man would die at 3 o'clock because I would not stand. They were entirely accurate about the timing and my posture." Wolfe's smile had the quality of winter sunrise, cold, clear, and illuminating. They were fatally incorrect about the identity of the victim. Their criminal enterprise died precisely on schedule, I observed, because you remained exactly where intelligence and preparation made movement not just unnecessary, but tactically superior. The individual reckonings. Wolfe's gaze swept over each participant in turn, delivering judgment with surgical precision. Dr. Thorne was the weather vane, pointing toward advantage regardless of loyalty. He dissolved his partnership while negotiating its sale, curated the Attorney General's process by smuggling in friendly experts, and would have recast his duplicity as diligence when convenient. Dr. Vance's participation was motivated by professional jealousy disguised as technical expertise. When Miss Kell offered him the opportunity to demonstrate his superiority while undermining competitors, he convinced himself he was serving professional standards rather than criminal conspiracy. Mr. Beckett combined wounded pride with social ambition. His family's lighthouse provided historical legitimacy, while his cartographical expertise enabled document alterations. He never recovered from our authentication of his family papers and saw this as an opportunity to restore his reputation while punishing those who'd wronged him. Clara shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "And me? Miss Bellamy," Wolfe said with cold precision, "your cooperation has earned legal immunity, but not moral absolution. You betrayed professional confidences, enabled criminal conspiracies, and participated in systematic destruction of innocent lives. Your legal freedom is purchased with moral bankruptcy that extends far beyond prosecution." The final resolution, the violation of this house, Wolfe continued, was intended as intimidation. Instead, it provided us with physical evidence of their methods, confirmation of their coordination, and justification for comprehensive investigation. Miss Pike's midnight entry with duplicate keys, her beef tallow message in Fritz's nutmeg, her long lens photography, all documented their capabilities while revealing their locations and timing. Kramer stood with the satisfaction of a man watching complex cases resolve through methodical investigation. The prosecutions will proceed on schedule. Kell and Thorne face conspiracy, fraud, extortion, and accessory to attempted murder. Pike and Vance are cooperating for reduced sentences. Beckett's claiming diminished capacity, but his technical expertise argues against that defense. "And the pattern of previous acquisitions?" Later asked. "We're coordinating with federal authorities to investigate Meridian's entire history. The pattern suggests they've been operating this scheme for at least 3 years. There could be dozens of victims who never realized they were targeted by systematic fraud rather than random misfortune." The philosophical conclusion. After the others departed, I looked at Wolfe with the expression of someone who just witnessed a masterclass in strategic thinking. "You never doubted we'd win." "I never doubted that they would defeat themselves," Wolfe corrected. Their scheme required them to predict and control multiple variables simultaneously while maintaining the illusion of supernatural insight. Such enterprises invariably collapse under the weight of their own complexity, especially when their targets refuse to be moved by threats, intimidation, or predictions, no matter how cleverly composed. He gestured toward the empty desk blotter where the evidence had been arranged, like pieces in a trial now concluded. "They sent postcards predicting that a man would die at 3 o'clock because I would not stand. They were entirely accurate about timing and posture. They failed to understand whose future they were predicting." "The lighthouse warned of danger, as lighthouses do," I observed. Wolfe's eyes moved to me with the satisfaction of a man who just watched the sea claim another ship that thought it owned the waters. "Indeed, Mr. Goodwin. But this time, the warning illuminated the rocks on which the senders had wrecked themselves. Ships strike rocks, not because rocks move to strike ships, but because navigators mistake the sea for their private domain." Fritz appeared in the doorway with the announcement that lunch was served, lamb with rosemary and wine selected to complement the morning's successful conclusion. Justice had been served with the kind of precision that made both food and sleep considerably more satisfying. The brownstone had been disturbed, but its sanctity had been reaffirmed. The postcards had predicted the future with perfect accuracy. They had simply failed to understand that in Nero Wolfe's universe, the most devastating victories are often achieved by remaining exactly where your opponents expect you to be while they exhaust themselves against your apparent passivity, which was both the resolution of the case and a comprehensive lesson in why threatening a man who understood the strategic value of immobility was considerably more dangerous than threatening someone who might be moved by fear, predictions, or postcard, no matter how cleverly composed or ominously delivered. The return to sanctuary. The Friday evening quiet in the brownstone felt earned, not the lazy kind you get when the city takes a holiday from itself, but the sober stillness that follows a job done clean and to the finish. By 7 o'clock, the house had exhaled completely. The tension that had coiled around us like an unwelcome python for the better part of a week had finally unspooled, leaving behind the kind of peace that makes you remember why you chose this particular line of work in the first place. Fritz had spent the afternoon restoring order with the methodical precision of a nation-state responding to invasion. Every lock gleamed with newness, every hinge had been tuned to whisper quiet operation, and the kitchen had been scrubbed to surgical standards. The violated Hungarian nutmeg had been retired to a locked cabinet, like a war memorial, replaced by a fresh jar that Fritz positioned on the shelf with the reverence usually reserved for religious relics. Wolfe occupied his chair with the immobility of a monument that had weathered a storm and emerged more firmly rooted than before. The evening beer sat at the perfect angle for contemplation, and his expression carried the satisfaction of a chess master who had achieved checkmate through strategic positioning rather than aggressive movement. The official accounting. The phone had been paying its respects all afternoon. Inspector Kramer called at 6:30 with the kind of comprehensive report that makes prosecutors smile and defense attorneys reach for stronger coffee. Final tally, he announced with professional satisfaction. Kell and Thorne are looking at 15 to 20 years each for conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to attempted murder. Pike's cooperation earned her 8 to 12. Vance is claiming diminished capacity, but his technical expertise argues against that defense. Beckett's trying to buy his way out with family money and historical society connections. Won't work. And the broader investigation? Wolfe inquired. Expanding daily, we've identified at least 7 other authentication firms that suffered mysterious scandals before being acquired by Meridian at below-market prices. The pattern goes back 3 years and involves millions in fraudulent acquisitions. Clara Bellamy's testimony is opening doors we didn't know existed. Lon Cohen had called earlier with news that the morning editions would carry 3-column headlines and enough detail to keep readers entertained through their coffee. The headline writers are calling it the Postcard Profit Case, I told Wolfe after hanging up. They're having more fun than the defense attorneys. Headline writers, Wolfe replied with characteristic disdain, are paid to distort rather than illuminate. The case was never about prophecy. It was about systematic fraud disguised as supernatural insight, executed by people who confused elaborate preparation with genuine intelligence. The evening's resolution dinner that evening was Fritz's tribute to restored order. Roast pheasant stuffed with wild rice and mushrooms, served with a delicate reduction sauce and asparagus tips so perfectly blanched they seemed to glow under the dining room chandelier. The wine was a robust Bordeaux that Wolfe had selected personally, its deep ruby color reflecting both the light and his satisfaction with the day's conclusions. We ate in the comfortable silence that follows successful resolution, the kind of quiet that doesn't need to announce itself. Only when the cheese course, a properly aged Stilton, had been presented did Wolfe break the contemplative mood. The human appetite for control, he observed, swirling his wine thoughtfully, is both insatiable and ultimately self-defeating. Miss Kell and Dr. Thorne believe they could orchestrate not merely the actions of their victims, but the very mechanisms of fate itself. He paused, studying the wine as if it contained additional insights. They sent their postcards, these petty prophecies, convinced that prediction was equivalent to control. They failed to comprehend that immobility, when strategically applied, is a form of profound action. It is the rock against which the tide breaks, not because the rock moves, but because it endures. Their greatest miscalculation, he continued, was assuming that elaborate psychological manipulation could substitute for sound judgment. They sought to impose their will through fear and manufactured crisis, rather than merit or genuine superiority. That is not strategy. It is merely vulgar ambition dressed in the cheap finery of cleverness. The final reflection. After dinner, we returned to the office where the desk blotter bore no trace of the postcards that had predicted death and delivered justice instead. The case. Files were organized and ready for the prosecutors who would spend the next several months unraveling the full extent of Meridian's criminal enterprise. Satisfactory, Wolfe observed, reaching for his after-dinner beer with the satisfaction of a man who had watched justice prevail through methodical application of intelligence and patience. The violation of this house has been answered comprehensively. The threats have been neutralized. The predictions have been fulfilled in ways their authors never intended. I looked at the empty space where the evidence had been arranged like pieces in a trial, now concluded. The postcards predicted that a man would die at 3 o'clock because you would not stand. They were entirely accurate about timing and posture, Wolfe confirmed with the quiet satisfaction of a chess master who had achieved victory through strategic immobility. They failed to understand whose future they were predicting. Their criminal enterprise died precisely on schedule because I remained exactly where intelligence and preparation made movement not just unnecessary, but tactically superior to any action they could have anticipated. The clock above his desk struck 9, marking the end of a case that had begun with anonymous threats and concluded with systematic justice. The brownstone settled into its evening rhythm, sanctuary restored, order re-established, and the proper balance between action and contemplation maintained. The lighthouse warned of danger, as lighthouses do, I observed, settling back in my chair with the satisfaction of a job properly finished. Wolfe's eyes moved to me with the expression of a man who understood that some lessons were worth teaching through example rather than explanation. Indeed, Mr. Goodwin, but this time the warning illuminated the rocks on which the senders had wrecked themselves. They attempted to move an immovable object through elaborate psychological manipulation. Instead, they discovered that some forces cannot be redirected through threats, predictions, or postcards, no matter how cleverly composed. He raised his glass with ceremonial precision. Ships strike rocks, not because rocks move to strike ships, but because navigators mistake the sea for their private domain. Our opponents mistook my immobility for weakness rather than strategic advantage. They learned, too late, that the most devastating victories are often achieved by remaining exactly where your enemies expect you to be while they exhaust themselves against your apparent passivity. Archie's last word. Outside, the city continued its restless motion, people hurrying toward destinations they thought were important, carrying problems they believed were urgent. Inside the brownstone, immobility had once again proven superior to action, patience had triumphed over panic, and the strategic application of absolute stillness had delivered justice with a kind of precision that made both dinner and sleep considerably more satisfying. "Well," I said, closing the case file with finality, "I guess that makes you the most dangerous sitting target in New York. Good thing they didn't predict you'd take up marathon running. That really would have thrown us for a loop." Wolfe's grunt could have meant anything from mild amusement to profound exasperation, but he was already reaching for the bell to summon Fritz for the evening's final service. The case was closed, the brownstone was secure, and the world, for another day, had been set right through the simple expedient of refusing to stand when standing wasn't necessary. The lighthouse had warned of danger. The danger had been real, but the rocks it illuminated had claimed the ships that thought they owned the waters, while the beacon itself remained exactly where it belonged. Immovable, reliable, and permanently positioned to guide others safely through treacherous currents, which, in Nero Wolfe's universe, was both the resolution of the postcard prophet case and a comprehensive lesson in why threatening a man who understood the strategic value of immobility was considerably more dangerous than threatening someone who might actually be moved by fear, predictions, or postcards, no matter how cleverly composed or ominously delivered.